Welcome to the Montana class. Now, this was supposed to be the most straightforward of all the classes to deal with. It really was. It was supposed to be the one where, frankly, there's so much information about I would be overwhelmed. There are drawings, there are pictures, there's an entire World of Warships section about the Montanas. And yet, very quickly I realized that the old history adage is true. The more history you have about something, the more you have myth. Add to that a design process which by its very nature is going to have design options considered. The whole spectrum of shall we do this modification, shall we do this modification, and then the timeline. And you can actually see why people get confused as to what a Montana actually is, i.e. what it would have been. I've read articles, which are, I would consider learned, qualitative, quality articles, written by people who I would consider peers in terms of history, who will honestly say that the design for the Montanas is 33 knots and 12 16-inch guns. Now, I have no qualms about the 12 16-inch guns. That's, I think, a standard. I think we can all agree there's that. But I'm pretty certain that at the point the US Navy is pitching at, in terms of technology, etc., the designs which have it at 28 knots are far more accurate. And that fits. That fits to me because, you see, there's a little bit of a silliness going on, but there's also a lot of sensibility going on in terms of what the US Navy is doing. There's silliness in terms of people considering it. There's sensibility in terms of what the US Navy is actually doing. You see, the Iowas were 33 knot ships, 35 knots if very light load. It's kind of the British appreciation of, this is the top speed we've designed it for. Honestly, Governor. Honestly. Going on with the Iowas. I love them dearly. Which means they're sort of fulfilling the fast ship role, which had originally going to be fulfilled by the Lexington class, back when the standards were first being built. So, what are the Montanas? Well, they're the new heavy standards. If you look at the designs which have come before the Iowas, the designs which have come in the last few years in this period, the North Carolinas, the South Dakotas, they're roughly 28 knot ships. 28 knot ships. They're good ships. There are 6 of them. They are 28 knot vessels. The Iowas, much faster, but if the Montanas were also 28 knot and you've built the 5 that were planned, well, then you have a nice solid battle line to draw from of 11 28 knot ships, and you're starting to replace your battle line. You're replacing your standard ships with a new standard of a 28 knot battle line. And that makes sense. The points I'm going to be considering the Montanas at is their point of conception, because the trouble is, during World War II especially, you have so many variations going on, so much information feeding into the design process, you get many, many designs coming out. But the point at which we can be fairly sure about them, and we can understand their position and their design philosophy best, for me, is the point at which we know, right then, they're widening the Panama Canal for them, and they're ignoring the treaties, because the treaties no longer count. So you're talking roughly 1914, 1941. And that's also where the design really does make the most sense, and explains why the final contract design is issued in June 1942. That design gives us the stability point. Now again, this is someone's probably going to go, well, if they've issued a contract design, surely we know exactly what their design is. And, you know, where are those people coming up with different designs and how they putting their information? Well, it comes down to how you think the Americans adapt to war and whether or not you think they're going to stop the construction. Well, they pause the construction, they're not really pushing the construction forward. Whether they're going to modify the construction or all the other things they could do. And, yeah, theoretically they can. It's like, theoretically there is an actual study conducted by the Royal Navy at one point of turning the Lion class into a hybrid battle carrier. The person who conducts the study is looked at by the Third Sea Lord as a sort of case of, did you have a lot of free time? Why? Because the battle carrier is, as always, is an answer to a question which is only asked if, how bad a situation do you think we're in? If we're at the level that we're going to be converting ships into building ships which are both aircraft carriers and have battleship guns, we're in a far worse situation than we are now, and we probably should no longer be fighting this war. Well, in the case of the Montanas, because they are authorized and under construction, there are people still working on them. There are people still having their ideas. The Bureau of Ships is actually still working on suggesting armoured decks that can be increased in thickness, and, you know, they're working on that, and they're ultimately cancelled in 1943. But the reason they're cancelled, I don't think is necessarily the reason that we often think them. And people portray and go, well, they're cancelled because you need aircraft carriers, not battleships, and that shows the era of the battleship's over. I don't think so, because if the era of the battleship had been conclusively proved to be over, they would have been cancelling the Iowas and everything else. I think the point that starts the Americans cancel the Montanas is the point they realise it's rather the same as the British cancelling ships at the beginning of World War, during sort of the start of World War I, when you think they should be just building these ships through, and certainly with Agincourt. But if they don't think the ships are going to be completed before the war's over, or rather they're not going to need them before the war's over, and let's be honest, with the sheer quantity of capital ships available to the Allies, and aircraft carriers coming through, and other systems, what circumstances they're going to need where they're going to need those extra ships versus putting that effort into other things. And more importantly, at the end of war, you want to be able to put your best ideas, all the information from the war, into building your best possible ships. Now, the British did this with G3s and N3s. That was their design. Limited by infrastructure limits, but again, the Montanas were also limited by infrastructure limits. They were limited by the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal was actually being widened, which is why they work. The third set of locks are being put in. Caramba. So much effort for battleships. So, and furthermore, if we go to their role, what were they for? As said before, they're part of that original battle line. The one lesson which comes through quite early on in World War II is that the battle line doctrine isn't going to be holding. It's now a task force doctrine. You still need capital ships. It's one of the, again, myths that comes up with people go, well now, because it's task force, it's aircraft carrier. Yes, they do have the long-range engagement, etc., but as several engagements the British have in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and several engagements they have elsewhere in the world, and the Americans have, show that it's best when you can have a mixture in this time period with this technology point. And this is one of the other things, because so often we're looking backwards and we're just going, we're presuming aircraft, or the people, talking on presuming aircraft have reached the point they, are equivalently capable then as they are today, and it's, no, they're not. They're not. They're getting there, but they're not. So you have the combination. You have this great big behemoth firepower with an aircraft carrier. Best combination is probably two pairs. A pair of battleships and a pair of aircraft carriers, with some cruisers and destroyers working as a task group. That is a foundational fighting point and a fighting unit which can take on all comers. That's really it. That's the reason the Eye was activated at various points throughout the Cold War, etc., is to try and recapture that, because a battleship is very good at killing things. But there's a problem with the Montana class at that point, which the Iowas don't have. If you're going to keep up with aircraft carriers, and you're going to be operating in town of aircraft carriers, you need to be at least 30 knots. They're 28 knot ships. How are you going to make them faster? Well, you could, I don't know, take out X-Turret, add in more power plant, but that's the sort of level you're looking at, and by that point you might as well build more Iowas, or an improved Iowa. So this is the thing. These are, for the US Navy, the last, what I would call standard Group 2 battleships. Their second second standard battleship set. And this is their design. They are meant to be this part of this humongous, thunderous force, which would make its way across the Pacific and be, in many ways, the anvil upon which the various hammers of the US Navy would crush the Japanese fleet. That is what the US Navy's battle line was supposed to be. It was the anvil of their operations. And that is something we have to consider when we're putting these things together, when we're thinking about these ships and what is likely with their design and what isn't likely design. What are likely decisions that they're going to make? What is their concept of operations? And concepts can change quickly. It's another thing which is interesting, is that sometimes you have historical sources written by people contemporaneously. They're their personal accounts. The amount of times the author will almost implicitly suggest what is the understanding of how things are done by the end of the war was the concept for how things would have been done always. And then you sort of look at it and go, well, hang on, when you were writing about this exercise prior to World War II or prior to World War I, and you were doing this, you say this. So either you're lying at this point, or you're lying at that point. Or alternatively, and this is usually the more correct thing than lying, but lying is the first thing that humans tend to go to. But in history, the first thing is going, okay, lying, and then the first thing we teach students is go, well, hang on, think about it. Maybe they're not lying. Maybe this has now been so ingrained by their experience of war that now it's become unthinkable for them to think of any other concept of how to do it. As such, this has now created a false narrative in their brain, which is just as true to them as what they were saying earlier. You're dealing with, at one period, them writing about an exercise which is a lifetime of peacetime service. Peacetime for a quantity of peacetime in any circumstance. You're dealing with that. Then you're dealing with the war experience, how they adapt. These are the people who tend to be still in senior positions at the end of the war, are the people who do adapt most quickly. But by the end of the war, the things they've been doing to fight the war are going to be ingrained in them at a bone-deep level by the losses that they have had, the successes they've had. And by losses, I mean even when you succeed, you're probably going to have people die. That's the cruel thing about war. Even when you win, you lose. So, the standard battleships and the whole American battle line doctrine, in many ways, had always been this battle fleet would be this anvil of attack. Whilst other systems, destroyers, cruisers, everything, would be driving the Japanese, pulling the Japanese towards this anvil. War Plan Orange. It's a book I've pointed to many times. It discusses the whole development of the American concept for operations in a Pacific War. It's a critical book. It's a critical plan for the US Navy in terms of how they're going to fight a Pacific War. But one of the constants for it is this use of their fleet, especially their battle fleet, as a constant movable force, constantly getting closer to Japan, going its own route, taking its time, but getting ever closer to Japan. And the important point about it being is that it's got to be able to sustain dealing with multiple attacks, because guess what? Whilst the Japanese work out their best idea is to do constant, almost naval guerrilla warfare, to wear down the American fleet and then defeat them in a battle closer to Japan, when they might have parity, or even they could dream of superiority in naval firepower, even if not in ships. Well, the thing is, the Americans worked that out too. They worked that out, that's the Japanese plan. It doesn't take a master strategist to work out that is the best, most logical and viable option for Japanese defense against something the size and quality of the United States naval juggernaut. In fact, it's very sensible. And because the Americans are also very sensible, they work it out. And so when they're designing their ships with that idea in mind, which is one of the reasons why their ships are designed as they are. Now, before I get into the whole stats, I'd like to introduce you to Utah. She is our UAD model of the day, Montana class. This is Utah. Currently travelling in foggy conditions, so her top speed's been limited to full speed rather than flanking speed. She is a big girl. Reflective of the fact that they have widened the Panama locks for her. Now, I will admit, the guns aren't in precisely the right positions, are they? But they're in the positions which UAD allows, so that's where they are, in terms of the secondary armament. There's also that joyous gap in superstructure there, which I'm not particularly pleased with, but it's the system. However, we have got 12 1650s. Now, I will be talking through the actual design specs shortly with a nice display next to me to talk them through. But UAD design specs, how does it change? How do you change and modify certain things? Well, this Utah has a slightly tougher armor belt, slightly thicker than Montana's would have been, and a slightly thicker deck. Literally, that's because when I put in the specs that they provided, and that is the specs for a Montana class, for some reason the stability profile was completely off for her long-range gunfire. And as it has been pointed out several times, the Americans and the Japanese were both far more interested in long-range gunfire than the British were, in terms of having a long-range gun duel. The British perceived long-range gunfire as something where you damage the enemy before getting closer and killing them off. The Americans and Japanese both thought of long-range gunnery as being almost potentially decisive. So there's a difference there. And that meant, for me, in order to produce an accurate version of a Montana, under the current version, which is 1.3.9.8 of UAD, stability and the fire stability index was more important to me than necessarily 100% accuracy with the thickness of the belt and the thickness of the deck. My also theory was that honestly the differences between 7.5 inches and the deck strength I went with, which is about 10 inches, is they're both frigging thick. And frankly, yeah, it will have some impact, but there again, the Yamato class that are on this have similar issues, and so does the Lion class, etc. All these designs, they have a differential in order to make them accurate in terms of their operating characteristics that necessarily occasionally requires for the game engine for me to modify their immutable characteristics of their design. Because I can't do the same things with them as a ship designer can do. I can't move the framing around. I can't shape things. I can only decide main belt, forward belt, aft belt. So to simplify it for a game, that's necessary. But it still works for our requirements. It provides enough of a level of realism that we can do some functionality testing of the design. As I always said, there are limitations to UAD because you don't have really allowance for a golden BB. It can happen. There is a stat in there, but you don't really have it. And you don't, again, have the luck, and you don't have the quality control issues, which is, again, why I don't tend to use the Italian Navy here, because the Italian Navy, if their quality was done well, and if they had good quality control, they were some of the best ships in the world. If their quality control was off, they had problems. And sometimes you have a mixed batch where you'd have 4 or 5 good shells and then 1 bad shell. And of course, if you're firing a salvo of 8 shells, that bad gun, that bad shell can throw off your salvo. But the US Navy didn't have that issue. And I will say this. Ooh, that looks mean and scary. Now, why have I gone with Utah? Why didn't I use any of the other names from the Montana class? Now, that was again another question for me, because one of the reasons sometimes when I'm doing the naming of the ships is sometimes if I feel it's closer, I will use a name vessel from the class. And I was tempted by Louisiana. I was tempted to say that this was the last one with some World War II evolutions I did on. But I went with Utah because it's not just a UAD version of a design built within the practicalities of Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts. It is a UAD version design of what I believe was the design which actually would have been built. And so I decided to go for another degree of separation. Yeah. That's a big ship. And that is not something you want coming towards you. Especially not when you're 4 merchant vessels, I think. I just set this one up so you could have a nice look at her. And see her in all her beauty. And I think The best angle from her is probably this one. They are good looking ships. But with 28 knot top speed, probably not fast enough for those carrier task forces. Carrier capital ship task forces, they need the higher speed. They really do. Now you've seen Utah. Let's consider the real Montana class. What are their real stats? So standard displacement, roughly 64,240 tons. So pretty decent. Pretty decent. Full load. And these are design specs. These aren't what they were built to. Because let's be honest, I remember you start building a ship, and I always love when people give me such exact figures and they go, yes, this is what the ship will be. And I'm going, you just designed it. Yes. Well, when you're building it, there are going to be imperfections reaching in. There's going to be a standard design you give out to a shipyard, and there's going to be a design that shipyard actually builds. And some of those docks which were building the ships were going to be building the ships actually had to build whole new docks. They were going to have to float them out. They couldn't launch them as they traditionally did because they were too big, they were too heavy, they were too massive. Which is a cool thing to think about. It is also a really interesting thing to put in context of the, the really large options considered prior to World War One. The Tillmans, because considering the infrastructure improvements need to be going in place to make the Montanas possible, and actually practically possible, shows you that for the Tillmans to be done would have required similar infrastructure investment, which of course is what Senator Tillman really did want, because Senator Tillman considered naval investment a good way to pay for infrastructure in home states as a good way for making people at home very happy. And for spreading the financial joy around the United States. That was his thinking. So, power came from 8 Babcock and Wilcox water tube boilers, which supplied 4 geared steam turbines. Rather than going into steam electric system, they were direct drive to drive 4 screw propellers for a top speed of 28 knots, or a range of 15,000 nautical miles at 15 knots. Complement? Well, in a flagship role, they could take 2,789 personnel, but in a normal ship, it'd be 2,355. Which is, again, interesting to think. The size of a staff group. What are they building these ships for? They're building them for fleet command. That's the point. When they are considering and designing Montanas, one of the things they're putting in is they're thinking about fleet command, about these vessels being the ships which are going to be used for commanding an entire fleet. In which case, a staff of 434 personnel sounds about right. This is not a squadron command staff. This is not a divisions command staff. This is a task group, task force, fleet command staff. That's the sort of size we're talking about in complement. 12 6-inch, 50 cal Mark 7 guns in 4 triple turrets. Again, this is where you get sort of an interesting thing in UAD, because I'm not sure if the 16-inch are really, especially in the 1940s build where the maximum, are really quite the same as the Mark 7. They are definitely as close as I can get to in UAD, and it's the same affects all the other guns. But yeah, not quite the same characteristics, I think. So, hello. We have got the Fluffy Research Assistant has decided after hours of sitting down below to join us up here. Hello. Yes, we have to go back a slide. Hello. So you've gone from sleeping to basically being very attentive and wanting something. Now, the main belt was supposed to be 16.1 inch or 409 millimeters thick. The bulkheads, 18 inches forward, 15 and a quarter inches aft. Again, this is an interesting thing to think about. Why is it heavier forward? You can't do that in the UAD design. You cannot structure that into the thickness of the bulkheads. Why are the barbettes thicker forward rather than aft? Do they expect you to take more damage forward? Is it helping balancing the ship? Well, to an extent, it is expecting more damage forward. They're expecting to come face to face with the enemy. They're expecting to be having to then turn and fire. So they're expecting the front's going to be exposed for longer. So therefore, you are more worried about, to an extent, about the front. But also, it's about balancing the weight of the engines, of the systems, across the wider vessel. Turret faces, 22.5 inches. Again, one of the interesting things about the Americans and the Japanese is they do both like to go for this very, very thick turret face, in contrast to most of the Europeans. And you sort of start thinking, why? Because you're still going to have the holes for the guns to be pierced through. But again, for the Americans, this is a big thing about their ships, and especially when you're considering how the range of engagement they're talking about. But again, it comes back to, and I think quite a lot of this stuff and quite a lot of these defences come back to, the idea of these ships are going to be going into a scenario where they are going to be attacked, where they are going to be attempted to be drawn in and drawn down. So they've got to be made as survivable as possible, and giving them the extra protection on the front of their turrets, that's extra protection. Not just for the mechanisms, but for the crew and personnel inside, who are a vital part of your ship to damage control, who are a vital part of your ship to its continuing operation, its ability to repair for operations, and a vital part to your wider war effort. There are points in long conflicts where it is more difficult to replace humans, the squidgy organic bits, than is the ships. That's always scary to people, but think about it. How quickly can you grow someone to have 20 years worth of naval experience? 20 years of running drills, 20 years of all that accumulative knowledge. The stuff that you've taught them that has been taught by experience in such a way that you can't really pass it on just by words in a book or by some instructor trying to pass on their wisdom. At a certain point, crew become more valuable than ships. The main deck, 7.05 to 7.35 inches thick. Again, think about that. Think about how thick that is. That's not far off this in thickness. That's thick. Now, usually at this point, someone goes, well, this shows the Americans really do understand their future because they are worrying about air attack, and that's why this whole deck is quite so thick. It's not. Yes, air attack is part of it. Yes, I'm not going to say it's not entirely. It's not there, not in there entirely, but it is a part of it. But it's also to do with long-range fire. If you remember, I've talked about how American ships and the American Navy was thinking far more about long-range gunfire and long-range engagements being critical than the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy was treating long-range engagements like, we will blind you. We will take out your ability to do long range, for your using your director fire with high explosive at long range, especially if we have spotter aircraft up airborne, and then we will close and kill you. That was the Royal Navy's policy. They wanted to take out your ability to direct your fire, and then they wanted to close to decisive engagement ranges and kill you. About probably the closest they were really conceivably thinking about getting us 18,000 yards for decisive engagement range in terms of British terms. But the Americans were thinking about engagements which were twice that distance, carrying on and being decisive. And again, think about the trajectory of gunfire and of the shells when you're firing at that range. Think about the angle the shell is going to be coming in at. It's going to be plunging fire. It's going to be coming in at an angle which is going to be coming in and hitting the deck, more than likely. Yes, it might still hit the top of the belt armour. It might still plunge into the hull. You never know. But it's also got a very good chance of coming in at an angle which means deck whack. And that means you've got to think about it in terms of your armour. If you get close, i.e. close enough, in terms of naval combat, they can't hit with guns your deck, because if you think about it, to do so they have to fire their guns at almost that angle to get the plunging shot. So you've got a zone where plunging shot can work, and you've got, once you get within a certain range, it's got to be direct fire. It's got to hit your structures, it's got to hit your hull, it's got to hit your turrets. And the American Montana class is designed to deal with this. And they're designed to deal with it well. But still, it's a very, very thick lump of metal. And again, because of long-range fire, and this is one of the other interesting things, people go, well, you know, was it only the Royal Navy which was obsessed with spotting? No, it wasn't. Reconnaissance, spotting. The US Navy was just as into it. In fact, even more so in some ways because of their desire for decisive long-range gunnery engagements, which were entirely possible. They would have involved a lot of misses of shells. And again, I would argue that this is perhaps, to an extent, the difference in focus is again a reflection of the geostrategic realities of the scenarios they're planning on fighting in. Because if all three navies are planning on fighting in the Pacific, the Royal Navy's industry, which is producing its shells for its battleships, are the other side of the world. And they have to bring the shells all the way to them, if they use them. Whereas Japan's are in, well, obviously Japan, which is one side of the Pacific, and they are already banking on the battles getting closer and closer and closer to the home islands, closer and closer to their infrastructure hubs, closer and closer to their warehouses, closer and closer to the factories which produce their shells. And the US Navy, well, they're based on the other side of the Pacific. And yes, they don't have the facilities on the west coast they do on the east coast, but they have the ability to bring a lot of supplies from the west coast and chase them down. And therefore it's an easier prospect to bring stuff, well, in the semicircle you tend to travel around them in the Pacific, to bring stuff across the Pacific to support them than it is for the British around the world. So again, they have more guaranteed supply. They also, unlike the British, are not considering the scenario where if they are fighting Japan in the Far East, there are annoying people in Europe who could start causing trouble. For most of the 1920s and 30s, that annoying person title goes to Il Duce, aka Mussolini. By the mid to late 1930s, Mustachio Gentleman, aka Hitler, has taken on that role, but either way, they are fairly certain they're going to need to leave some of their force and some of their logistics and supplies back in the home fleet, back in the Mediterranean, to watch them. Which again affects the numbers the British are planning on building and the whole organisation they're planning on adopting. Although, there again, there are some plans out there, and I did put a post in the community page. You should find a link down below to the community section of this channel, and you'll find posts there about suggestions for some of the videos for Christmas period, but also you'll find, if I go back to that, you'll find a post which has details from Matthew Warwick's research, where he showed you all the details of some of the British plans in May 1939 for the possible deployment of their forces in 1942 in order to deter conflict, in the case of an Axis war, or in the case of a Far Eastern war. You notice they haven't got a scenario of, in case of war with everyone, because that is the worst nightmare, and they don't believe they'd be ready for that unless the government gave them a huge amount more supplies, because the government was, you know, so you need more, you need to fulfill both the requirements of the Axis War Fleet deployments and the Far Eastern Fleet deployments, which I think requires roughly, from memory, instead of 21 capital ships, requires about 28. Requires an extra 8 carriers. And about an extra 20 to 30 cruisers. It's just, and these are the cruisers which are the new cruisers which carry aircraft and have aviation facilities, because the plan he's looking at is the aviation deployment and where they deploy. It doesn't, interesting enough, include HMS Unicorn, which is fun for those of us who know what she was going to go on to do. But it's there, and it's a factor. But the US Navy doesn't have to deal with that. So the US Navy can afford to think about things like doing long-range engagements and wasting perhaps a lot of shells zeroing on target and losing, because they have got that logistics supply behind them. They have got that supply coming through. And again, there is what their ships are designed. Their ships are designed to be firing en masse. So, you know, this is the whole idea of this new battle line, this new standard of 28 knots. This is going to be a massed force coming in and firing as a group and going, come and deal with us. And the real point you have to consider here is, in the time the Japanese build Yamato and Musashi, pretty much those are the only 2 ships they build. The US builds the 2 North Carolinas, the 4 South Dakotas, and pretty much 4 of the 6 Iowas. Pretty much 4 of the 6 Iowas. Okay, they're sort of paused at one point, but, you know. That's a huge differential in construction and in firepower, because you could turn around and go, yes, our Yamato is capable of fighting 2 ships. Cute. We're bringing 4 to 1. You're not able to fight 4 to 1. That's also, to be fair, the Royal Navy's policy as well. Their view is that you turn up 1 ship, we'll turn up with 2. You turn up with 2 ships, we'll turn up with 6. That's not stupid. And that's not silly. That's sensible. Because whilst it's nice to play as someone who's interested in naval history in the naval version of Top Trumps, that doesn't tell us anything. Because 1v1, it's a nice demonstration. I'll do a video with a 1v1 of Utah taking on Yamato, and just to show you what it's like. But more realistically, and I'll also do this video, it'd be 2 or even 3 or even 4 Montanas versus 1, maybe 2 Yamatos. That's the reality they'd have to fight. Don't think that goes well for anyone who's fighting the 4 ships. And this is the design. These are some of the drawings and some of the outlines. You can find them. They are good looking ships. They are definitely American style vessels. As you can see, it's kind of a interesting thing with the secondaries, because the design shows both options. The option in the top option is the option which I've adopted for the Utah. The bottom option is the option which is shown in the side profile. And I think that option would have been more likely than the top option. But it's a possibility. It's a possibility they go for the option which actually Utah is configured as. They do certainly look good in that formation. It's a good design. Anyway, let's go to a UAD assisted discussion section before we get to the summary shot. Hello, and welcome to, well, a one-on-one engagement. And hopefully you can hear me very clearly. For me, it's currently pretty damn loud. So, I'm going to turn the volume down just a tad. Alright, that's better. That is better. So, where is our Japanese opponent? Over there. Now, my plan is to try and keep them at maximum range, to do the full American matched range, maximum range engagement doctrine, because it's one-on-one with an 18-inch gun ship. And as much as Utah might have more armor than even, I would, even at a certain point, than the actual Montanas did, life doesn't always go that well. So, it's better to keep your opponent at range. In this case, I'm letting them do the running towards me. My maximum speed, because of the engine which Utah has, which, the engine of UAD, where they actually do factor in the potential for construction design issues. Ooh, that's beautiful. Means that she's actually got a top speed limitation of 27.9 knots rather than 28.5 as I designed them for, to try and make sure they had a 28 knot top speed. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. I'm hoping there's no golden BB, because at certain points in this game, when I've done this today, there has been golden BBs both ways. I mean, quite literally, the one of the shells managed to land between the aft turrets. An 18-inch shell pops down there. And you can imagine the result on poor Utah. The odds of a shell actually doing that are something like 1 in a trillion. But it happened. So that led to a big explosion aft. And suddenly Utah was no longer really fighting back. Let's see. They're going at full speed, hopefully, to try and catch me. Ooh. That's gonna reach the 16-inch at some point, but I might need to alter my angle a tad. Actually, no, we're doing about right. We're doing about what I want to do. I am not going to get over-eager with this. I am not going to end up repeating. And the reason I'm doing this on manual control is because every time today I've done this with letting the AI control it, it's gone, wow, we've got thick armor on this ship. Let's get down to suicidal ranges. With an 18-inch gun ship, that's not sensible. Even with this one having 12, 16-inch guns, at a certain point, the 18-inch shells just cause too much damage with a single hit. And if you manage to get down to close enough range that you're exchanging salvos, then it's whoever manages to get the luckiest hit first. Now, of course, Utah has her heavy shells, which means she will cause a lot of impact when she hits. You would never actually do this in real life. But I know the range has got to be roughly 35 kilometers. So I just knocked off 5 kilometers to speed things up a bit. The moment the guns start to move, I'm going to start adjusting the speed, the direction of the Utah. But we'll leave that to one side. So, the point is, one-on-ones, as I said, don't really tell us much about the ships in terms of real-term combat of what they do. But they are cool, and they do give us a chance to explain the differentials. Because in many ways, in my mind, the Montanas are the response to the Yamatos. Despite the fact that them technically being produced without knowing about the Yamato's existence, the fact is, having something with so much firepower being built and such capability to anchor your battle line, well, the odds are you're not building it for the good of your health. You're not building it because you really have a massive desire for it. Because, let's be honest, 9 16-inch guns is very powerful. That's more powerful than most battleships in the entire world. Joy of long-range engagements. Ooh. A lot of misses. I'm trying to keep them at the tip-top of range, because at the tip-top of range, the angle of guns, the fact that these are limited to roughly 30-35 degrees, and those are limited to roughly 30-35 degrees, mean that actually the 16-inch guns have an ever so slight range advantage over the 18-inch guns. And it's always better if your opponent can't fire back. I mean, really, the people who believe you have to get into the range of your opponent to fire back are just... Well, I know that there's being sporting and there's being stupid. Now, the thing is, the Yamato has the ability, with its speeds, to close this down if it wants to. And that would be the sensible thing, perhaps, for it to do. Especially at this point. But as long as I keep watching it, hopefully I can anticipate that maneuver. Well, at the moment, I'm just hovering at the edge of its range. Oh, I think I've hit something major over there. Yeah. Turret penetration. They're out of 18-inch gun. They're out of 18-inch shells. It's not good when that happens to them. It really isn't good. really not good for them. Well, at this point I can hand you over to the AI control. Because they're out of they're out of shells, so they can't do any damage. Yeah, that's got no... That will have no... due to the way UAD functions, that will have no 18-inch shells left. You golden BB'd her. Utah, that was cruel. I know she's golden BB'd you a lot today, but, you know, that's still not fair. This point in real life, this ship would be trying to get away, having its fires putting out by the succession shells coming in. Yowza. Now, there are several people who do accuse me of my Yamato being designed to be part of the Japanese Space Force. It isn't. It is just as heavily armoured, in fact more so because of the way UAD works, than the real life vessel. But the thing that they don't have, which I would love to see implemented in the game, in the system, is a division of magazines. Because even with Utah here, if one of her turrets went up, all of her ammunition would be lost. It would either go up or be flooded. And you think, well, actually, no, that's the whole point of having separate magazines. So if they have to crash flood one because of fire and the risk of penetration, they still have the other one. They still have the ARF guns. Which is the big problem, I would argue, with Nelson and Rodney, because, you know, they don't have that. For obvious reasons. And it's also why the G3s and the N3s are structured like they are, because they do have a separate magazine for the third turret. I would say in some designs, there is one design going around where they appear to be gone, but yes. So, yeah, I am... Oh, good lord. The fact that you're still fighting and firing at this point is just computer magic. Absolute computer magic. Be interesting to see what the Japanese response to the Utah, to the Montanas being built would have been. My view is it would have been absolutely nothing, because what they've actually managed to build. They've just wrecked their economy building the Yamatos, and if war does hold off for longer and they do complete more than 2, they have them, great, but what are they going to do with them? They've got to fight the North Carolinas, they have to fight the South Dakotas, they have to fight... Oh, hang on. They have to fight pretty much everyone. They have to fight the Iowas. They have to, and also they have to fight the Montanas. It's just not fair. There's no chance on that cycle of the Japanese actually being able to build anything enough which can actually fight back or actually change the scenario for them. And I know I keep re-emphasizing this in videos recently, but honestly, World War II, even more than World War I, because of its global nature, is an infrastructure war. Right. So, all in all, they're a good design. I think I've tried to say that the whole way through. And they're a sensible design. 28 knots is entry-level speed for fast battleship designation. But it's a good speed to have for a battleship that's designed to fight in the battle line. I think this is the case, if there had been a realization by any Navy, and it's rather interesting is that both the Royal Navy and the US Navy in various exercises do practice these sort of task forces. And it's the combination I've often said is if you had the Lexington-class battlecruisers with Lexington-class aircraft carriers, they would have been formed into the reconnaissance fleet of the United States Navy, and they'd have been using them as task force, and they probably developed that sort of doctrine even more. And it might well have filtered into more than just the Iowas in terms of their speed requirements. But in terms of the UK, well, the King George V's are 28 knot ships, which is fast, but entry level. And one of the reasons why the Royal Navy's building the Vanguards, one of the reasons why they set the speed for the Lions at 30 knots, for Vanguard at 30 knots, is to replace Renown, Repulse and Hood, longer term. And to build up the faster ships to operate in their carrier capital anti-surface radar task forces, which they have, and they orientate themselves into from the beginning of World War II. It's one of the really interesting things. That integration basically is enacted from exercises straight away. And it's always viewed as sort of something you do to deal with surface radar. But very quickly it becomes the modus operandi for how they operate as a formation in the Mediterranean, for how they operate in any circumstances. And it's one of the reasons which makes Task Force Z quite so strange. You know, deploying that task force to the Far East without a carrier is quite out of British doctrine. It's completely not within British doctrine at the time. And doctrine and the changes in doctrine is ultimately for me why these ships aren't finished. Because the US could have finished them. The US has, functionally, for World War II, unlimited resources. Yes, I know they don't have unlimited resources. I do realise that's not a real thing, but functionally, in terms of any construction project they truly believe is absolutely necessary, they can do. Even if they believe it's moderately necessary, they can do it. So what is the problem with this class? Well, again, it's the 28 knot speed. 28 knots, you need to be able to go faster to hang with the fast carrier task forces. You need to be able to provide that strategic forcement and maneuverability. And then you go, well, okay, so actually what you need them as part of your battle force, your collection of battleships which you're keeping together for the purposes of what happens if the Yamato class comes out to fight. What happens if the Japanese battle line comes out to fight? Well, again, you sort of go, well, hang on, you already have the North Carolinas, the South Dakotas, the Iowas. You have the upgraded standards when they're available. You have enough. You don't need them for that role because the Japanese haven't managed to implement much of a construction effort in reality because they've limited themselves by trying to build two behemoths. And so this vessel can neither provide the speed necessary to integrate with the carrier task forces, or the firepower, and you don't need its firepower necessarily for an actual fight with the Japanese battle fleet. You don't need it then. You don't need it. Now, at this point, is usually someone will probably comment below, well, you're good, you've just realised they didn't need battleships at the end of halfway through World War II. They realised it. No, that wasn't the case. They needed battleships. But the roles they needed battleships for, they already had filled. And this couldn't fill the only role they were short of escorts for. And you can argue the entire reason the Alaska class are actually completed is because of their speed and because they can actually keep up with the carrier battle groups rather than these. If these had been improved Iowas with the same speed as the Iowas but 9 16-inch guns, or maybe, I don't know, 12 in 3 quad turrets or something, or still 12 turrets but even slightly bigger and slightly faster, I can guarantee you some of the Montanas would have been completed. For the same reason the British finished off the King George V's and Vanguard. Because whilst you might be able to sink an enemy battleship with X, Y, or Z, your guaranteed ability to sink it is with your own battleship. And when you're a nation which is at war, for whom naval strength and naval power are not a would like to have, but are an absolute necessity, you do not take the risk of relying on X, Y, or Z when you can also have this. You just don't. People often get strange when they look at defense and they go, well, it's not like, it's not streamlined like industry procurement is and companies. Well, the worst thing that happens if a company makes the wrong decision is it goes bankrupt, and a lot of people are unemployed, which is terrible for them, and all the investors lose their money. But on the scale of things, hopefully they're all still alive and they can rebuild. The worst thing that happens if you make the wrong decision in terms of fleet procurement is a lot of people get killed and you possibly lose a war and your nation ceases to exist. So, yes, new thing A might be spectacular. But until you're 100% sure that A is going to do all you require of it, you're probably still going to keep building B. In fact, you're going to keep B in for as long as you can, as you need it to be. And again, post-World War II, no one else is building battleships. The Soviets aren't finishing off battleships. If they had, I can guarantee you some new battleships would appear from America, the UK, possibly even France. I can guarantee it. No matter what the financial cost. Especially in the 50s. And again, usually at this point people will go, they'll sort of point to me and go, well, the cost of it, you're building the carrier. They would have built them. They would have. I think the world's, to this day, largest economy, the United States case, and the world's 5th largest economy, in the case of the UK, could afford it. They might complain about spending the money on defense. They might go, oh, this. But they would find the money. They're always going to complain about spending the money on defense. But they would have built the battleships. Why? Because can you be certain? Whereas with a carrier battle group, which has a capital ship, so it's a carrier capital battle group, if they're engaging another carrier capital battle group, they can definitely win. If they're engaging an enemy capital battle group, which just has capital ships, well then they have a marked superiority. Because they have the answer, i.e. the equivalent, and they have the answer, i.e. the new system, to engage. And that's what you want. You don't want to fight wars fair. And Montanas weren't about fighting wars fair. They're about turning up with the sheer, vast, most amount of firepower the US Navy could put together in a group, because it's not just one of them turning up, it's the group of them turning up with all their friends, so that when you turn up to fight them, they overwhelm you. In UAD, you can put one design of a battleship into an engagement. You can't put multiple designs. Again, something I'd love to change about the... well, you can do that in the thing which is the campaign, but you can't do that in the basically sandbox battles, which I often use for testing. If you could do that, well, you could match up entire battle fleets, and you would soon, when you see them all sort of massed out again alongside each other, you'd soon see the difference between the US Navy's plan and what everyone other than the Royal Navy in the 1930s can bring. There is a huge difference. Huge difference. But let's consider that grander battle. And this one is going to be 5, I think, from memory, Montanas versus 3 Yamatos. We have, in this scenario, 5 Montanas, or rather Utahs, in terms of design. Ouch! I wish they didn't do that. Rhode Island and Utah have just had fun. We are against 3 Yamatos. So basically, it's full class versus full class. Well, theoretically, Yamato should have been 4, but my theory is if they'd got more than 3 there, there would be more Montana. There would be Iowas and other things there. So basically, you've got an entire battleship squadron. It's always nice to have them along. Divide into 2 divisions. Letting the AI work it out. For the moment. Trying to get Truxton killed. Valiantly trying to get Truxton killed. Because it's valiantly trying to charge straight into their concentrate their greatest firepower. This is, of course, to an extent, the nightmare for both sides, but it could have happened. You've got a squadron, battle squadron versus a battle squadron. Cruisers are fighting each other elsewhere. Destroyers are fighting each other elsewhere. It happens. And it is a constant flow of shells going backwards and forwards. Yes, it's at 5 times speed. Yeah, this one's... Oh, yeah, she's gone. Please note, before anyone starts going, Alex, do you design the Yamatos to die in this game? Not at all. They have... I think it's 26 inches of armor around the sides of the turret and 12 inches of armor on top of the turret. The only vessels which have thicker deck armor than the Yamatos are the Montanas in this, as I've set it up. And oh, Utah, what's happened to you? Again, very, very thick turrets. Utah, please. You out. And go off elsewhere, please. So Utah is bravely trying to get to safety, but is going to sink very shortly. Because she got similar. It's a factor of Ultimate Animal Dreadnoughts that they do seem to have designed it so that the turrets are able to provide an example of an early space rocket. Always helpful when they do that. Now, really I should have them targeting them, and them targeting there. And that's what I will do. Make sure both ships are being equally deluged. But again, getting close to one of these things is not a good idea. They have 18-inch guns. Close range operations against something with 18-inch guns are not to be advised under any circumstances. Really not to be designed. Hello. Out you go. Thank you. Did you go out? You did. Sorry. Rather large bumblebee came buzzing in. I didn't feel like turning my office into a honey production facility, so I asked it to leave. Ouch. Put AI in charge of both. I'll leave them both to engage. Colorado has basically been untouched. Yashima is... Truxton's gone now. Oh, good lord, that's problematic. That was a flagship. But I don't think Yashima's long for this world. Again, it's because they got the ladder to get to close range. How that's still firing, let alone... How is that still firing anything? It isn't. That's good. I think it's only its 8-inch guns are working. The fact that I think that one claims its 18-inch gun is still firing is worrying to me. Yeah. Sorry. Fly coming. Then why are they all coming in today? Are you giving off... Sorry. Talking to the fluffing research assistant. Yashima's gone. There are now 3 ships versus the last remaining one. The rest... Ooh, Truxton, what happened to you? You got holed severely. But this is despite actually having a much thicker belt than historically. Then we've got Utah, and Utah's quite easy to see what happened. She managed to get golden BB'd on here. Rhode Island looks fine. Florida looks fine. And Colorado just looks out like she's out for a Sunday sail. And Yamashiro is pretty much gone. It's a win, but it's not a way to win would actually have gone in a battle, if you can think about that. In a real battle, and even in this period. Even when they were talking about when they were building the Montanas and planning them, those battleships and their task forces would already have to deal with airstrikes, would have had to deal with destroyers launching mass torpedo attacks, would have had to deal with cruisers. All those things as part of the engagement. Because again, a naval battle is rarely A versus B. Usually it's the group A versus Group B, and the cumulative firepowers and how they intermix, how they impact each other, and especially it's how they come together. Does it happen that your destroyers run into their cruisers, who are all primed, sort of like the Dido class, to wipe out destroyers? Because let's be honest, the 5.25, its high rate of fire, made it a perfect destroyer killing machine. So, as you guessed it, my response to my idea that the response to that Yamato class from the United States is the Montanas. I wouldn't be surprised if there was an evolution of them, if they made something faster. I would also not be surprised if someone had the bright idea of maybe tacking on a 5th or even a 6th turret. Because again, the US Navy has a history of adding on extra guns on the stern. So I could imagine them doing so. Maybe going, right then, we're going to extend this hull and we're going to put in a 5th turret on the stern. So then we have 15 16-inch guns versus 9 18-inch guns. Yeah, that's an easy response. They could go with 18-inch guns, but I doubt it. The US Navy had already worked with them and decided that they didn't like them. They didn't like the rate of fire. Again, because they were thinking about long-range engagement and they wanted to get the volume of shells down range to actually get that hit at long range. And as you've seen in the videos today, long-range engagements, they can be pretty scary because of the angle of the shells coming in. Now, admittedly, does seem to a function UAD, which does mean even if you have 12 inches of armor on the top of your turret, which that Yamato does have, it's not always enough. You have 15-inch barbettes. Those things are thickened lumps of armor wandering around to balance out and give them the same sort of characteristics as the Yamato class. And yet, no. It just doesn't work that way. So, response to the Yamato class? Yeah, I think the Montanas are it. Honestly, I think the US Navy at a certain point is just going, The only reason I think the Royal Navy might do something, and the reason I came up with the idea of Dreadnought, and I think the US Navy might end up building a faster Montana, still with the 12 guns, but with our class speed, is that for the Royal Navy, they are stretched that much more than the US Navy. The US Navy can concentrate their fleet. They have to worry less about Europe, because between them and Europe is Britain. So the Royal Navy has to deal with those idiots, as far as the US Navy is concerned. And the US Navy does, to an extent, think about that. They think about dealing with Mussolini, dealing with Germany. Yeah, that's the Royal Navy's primary job. The Royal Navy will manage that threat. We can focus in on the Japanese. The Royal Navy has to think about dealing with the Japanese as well. And they have to worry about all of them because of the way the British Empire is spread out, because of the Mediterranean, the value of the Mediterranean, because of the value of India, because of the value of Far East, because of Australia. They cannot afford to ignore anyone. So they have to worry about maybe not being able to bring the total cumulative force they are able to generate to bear on Japan. So maybe producing some of the maybe changing the line. At the moment, they know about the Yamatos changing line designs because they're building a batch of to 12-gun ships. That seems perfectly viable to me. You know, it's the same as Montana's done in gunfire. perhaps then producing 2 more, which are Dreadnought style, with 4 quadruple turrets. Yeah, I could see them doing that. Maybe they produce a couple of 2 batches of those. But those ships are also, this will sound strange, also value of, let's say you leave one of them in Home Fleet and one in the Mediterranean Fleet, while you take the rest to the Far East. Why would you do that? That's leaving some of your best ships behind. Because those ships alone, let's be honest, anything the Germans can produce in that time period, they haven't got a single thing they could produce which is going to be able to match something which has got a top speed of 30 knots and 16 16-inch guns. Their infrastructure just won't allow them to build it. Not quick enough that it's going to, in the 1942-45 period, it's going to appear. Maybe, after they develop their infrastructure, put in years and years of investment, 1948 onwards, they could produce something. Possibly in that period. But by that point, the British could well have dealt with the war with Japan and could concentrate their fleet in home waters. It's the same with the Italians. The Littorios are excellent, but they're it. They're what the Italian Navy can produce. The Italians build them, but they're not planning on then building a whole stream more. No, they're just planning on finishing off the Littorios. So again, you have something floating around the Mediterranean, which has 16 16-inch guns, that kind of goes, hello. Whereas, for the US Navy, the Montanas are part of their battle line. They're a core part of their battle line. I can imagine any class which comes after them, the question is going to be asked as, are we building this for our battle line, or are we building this for our task forces? And especially once you start ordering the absolute swarm of Essexes, the absolute overwhelming swarm of Essex class vessels, you have to ask yourself whether the next batch of ships after Montanas are going to be built as a response to that. And I think they are. I think they would probably be, and even if they did, as I said, learn about Yamato, I think they would be 12 16-inch gun ships, but they would have Iowa level speed. Does that make sense? Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. It's been a little bit different, but I all the key ships from the series, I like to make them discussions about a ship. If you want a discussion where we go into all the in detail technology, I can do those. But there are people who can do that better than me, and there are lots of videos out there which do that. But one of the things I've noticed with this series is doing the stuff around the ships, the reasons for them, how they're going to be used. That's done less. Anyway, I'd love to hear what your ideas are, whether you think I'm right about the Montanas and their likely successors, and whether you agree with the... Well, I found one other person which has got a similar view on the cancelling of the Montanas as me, but most of the books seem to just go, they were cancelled due to the rise of the aircraft carrier, and it's... You're right, but you're emphasising on the aircraft carrier as the weapon system, rather than the aircraft carrier as the system they have to now cooperate with, and that means they have to raise their speed up, rather than the carrier having to drop their speed down. Because that's, again, the differential in operation. And it's something the British realised quite quickly in World War II with the King George V's, that when a carrier was operating with them, they'd speed up to do their air operations or other things, and then they'd have to slow down and come back to the battleship, because the battleship couldn't keep up with them. Even a 28-knot ship couldn't do it. It's a problem. Thank you very much for watching, and hope you enjoyed.